He peevishly wrote in the margins of the file, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?"
Now, in any oppression narrative, there are 1,000,001 little stories that usually end up being false or misleading due to a lack of a sense of proportion. So first, let's figure out what time frames we're even talking about here. Here's an animated map of India going from the far past to today. So it looks like the East India Company gains a foothold in 1757 in Bengal. Then from 1757 to around 1818 is how long it took for them to take control of most of India, so that will be considered a transition period. And everything past 1818 is more or less the rule of Englishmen. The territories expand into modern-day Pakistan and Burma, but the central and most populous regions of what later became the British Raj were more or less under English control by 1818. And in terms of who was in charge, we can basically divide Indian history, as far as we're concerned, into 4 periods. The pre-European period, which is before 1505, the European contact and coastal outposts starting with Portuguese India, going from 1505 to 1757, then the period of East India takeover, or the transition period to English rule, 1757 to 1818, and the period of English rule, or at least English domination, 1818 to 1948. And this is the period we're most concerned with. And there are many claims of oppression laid at the feet of the English, and they generally fall into 4 categories: deindustrialization, genocide, de-education, and looting of wealth. So let's start with deindustrialization. There's this meme going around how India, at its peak, produced a quarter of the world's textiles, but then this proportion shrunk to around 4% of world production, and a similar story occurred with India's percentage of the world economy generally. The exact numbers vary depending on who's saying this, but this is the general narrative. And of course, it's true. India made up a smaller proportion of the world economy, but it's not because their economy shrank, but because Europe and Europe-like countries such as Japan grew during the Industrial Revolution, which is known as the Great Divergence. And I listened to speeches and talks by this guy Shashi Tharoor, and one thing he mentioned was that the British destroyed the Indian textile industry.
Britain's rise for 200 years was financed by its depredations in India. In fact, Britain's Industrial Revolution was actually premised upon the deindustrialization of India. The handloom weavers, for example, famed across the world, whose products were exported around the world, Britain came right in. There were actually these weavers making fine muslin, light as woven air, it was said. And Britain came right in, smashed their thumbs, broke their looms, imposed tariffs and duties on their cloth and products, and started, of course, taking the raw materials from India and shipping back manufactured cloth, flooding the world's markets with what became the products of the dark and satanic mills of Victorian England. That meant that the weavers in India became beggars, and India went from being a world-famous exporter of finished cloth into an importer, went from having 27% of world trade to less than 2%.
Now, my first thought was that they probably just outcompeted India since it was machines versus hand spinning. But then I thought, you know what? Why don't I just check if this is actually true? Imagine if this basic statement of fact that the Indian textile industry declined when the English took over, if this was just matter-of-factly false. And of course, it is. The English were very good record keepers and kept track of how much clothing was produced in India, how much they were exporting, to where, how much they were importing, etc. And what Michael Twomey reported, sourcing the Indian Statistical Abstract, was that from 1880 to 1929, the domestic production within India of machine-spun cloth increased over 9-fold, and hand-spun cloth actually increased around 3.5-fold. Broadbury, Custodis, and Gupta do an analysis that goes even further back, and they conclude that textile production was increasing, though not at this pace, as far back as 1750 up to 1871, which is when Twomey's analysis began. And what is true is that exports of Indian textiles went down, and imports of textiles from Britain were also increasing during this period. And all these clothes were going to the Indian population, and the price of clothes in India collapsed. By 1871, the cost of any given item of clothing was less than half of what it was in 1750. Actually, having checked my sources again, it looks like Indian textile exports actually increased after a decline from the 1790 number, matching that export volume by 1880. So even if we're just talking about exports, no, the Raj ultimately presided over an increase in Indian textile exports after an initial decline. So even that line, that Indian export volume declined, is misleading and more false than true. Not that it even matters given how much textile production increased in India and how almost all of that increase was going to the Indian population. And another addendum, where did Britain get its cotton from? Well, from 1806 to 1880, about 65.9% of Britain's cotton came from the United States, according to Stanley Chapman from the University of Nottingham. So I guess Britain industrialized on the back of the United States and prevented the United States from industrializing because buying cotton from someone prevents them from building factories. And that's why the United States never managed to industrialize. Oh wait, Thoreau's retarded. And if you look further back, Brazil makes up roughly 64.5% of all British cotton imports from 1786 to 1809, and almost nothing is coming from Asia. From Frank Hitchcock's work, Agricultural Imports to the United Kingdom 1896 to 1900, it's stated that 74% of the UK's cotton came from the United States over these years, 22% came from Egypt, and a whopping 1.7% came from India. 1.6% came from Brazil, and China, Peru, and Chile, in some combination, apparently made up most of the rest, although where the rest comes from, he doesn't quite say. But unless someone can find some compelling data to the contrary, it appears that Britain got almost none of their cotton from India, that most of their cotton that went into British textile mills came from Brazil, the United States, and Egypt. And of those three, only Egypt ended up being really poor. So this seems to go against the idea that buying cotton from someone prevents them from industrializing, but it's irrelevant since the UK bought so little of their cotton from India anyway. When the Impressionists, as I call them, claim that India was deindustrialized, they're mainly talking about textiles. And it's shocking. They're literally just wrong. This isn't even a debate point. They're just balls in your face wrong. That talking point is literally just a lie, and this is something that's somewhat difficult to convey to a normal person, because a lot of people have a hard time believing that a guy like Thoreau, who's promoted by so many institutions, given so many awards, and has all these credentials and all these funny hats and all these people promoting him, and is, for example, speaking at the Oxford Debating Society, would be wrong about such a simple, verifiable, and central point. But here it is. And I think one problem is that this is a founding myth for India. In fact, it's on their flag that the British prevented Indians from producing textiles. So how do you tell them that not only is this not true, but it's 180 degrees in the opposite direction, that the British rule led to a roughly tenfold increase in textile production within India, and that Gandhi was either a liar or kind of stupid. But then what are we doing here? Are we just doing make-believe? Do you want the British to be the bad guy? Do you have some psychological need for that? It would almost be easier if Thoreau's error was more sophisticated, something that a smart person would make, because I could point out the nuance of that error and it would be more believable that intelligent researchers could make this kind of high IQ error. But no, it's simple, and people like Thoreau should be embarrassed, as should anyone who parroted this talking point without bothering to check out. Another basic indicator of early industrialization is steel production. Less common a talking point is that English prevented steel production in India. And of course, it's literally just the opposite. In 1910, India produced about as much steel as they had for the past 3,000 years. Virtually none. Virtually. I mean, you can probably find some tech priests in the ancient past who stumbled upon steel, but basically it wasn't produced in India. And then it went up to 443 kilotons per year by 1930. By comparison, Italy produced 1,743 kilotons, and Japan produced 1,377 kilotons annually in 1930. So India went from virtually no steel production to slightly less than 1/3 of Japanese steel production in 20 years. And incidentally, Indian production of pig iron increased almost 15 times, and more than half of it was exported, i.e., India went from being an importer to an exporter of pig iron under English rule. So this line of India being deindustrialized, this is beyond retarded. The exact opposite is true to an undeniable degree. And of course, railroads, which are a really big deal. Railroads allow for more regional specialization and interregional trade over longer distances, and each area doesn't have to be self-sufficient and can specialize. Now, the Oppressionists have a kind of knee-jerk mockery of the importance of railroads in India, or they'll make the tautological claim that the railroads were built to serve the British, not the Indians. And of course, this is true, but so what? When guys like Leland, Stanford, and Vanderbilt built railroads, they were building them for themselves, not for the public. They were building them to make money for themselves. But so what? It still did the job of building rail lines in such a way that allowed for specialization between regions in the United States, and it benefited the British to interconnect the Indian economy to allow for regional specialization. For example, the parts of India that produced indigo, the British didn't want them wasting their cropland producing rice, and would have other regions produce more rice so that the British could get the indigo, which they bought with money. Sure, you could point out the railroads built for military purposes in India, but that's true everywhere else. Every European power built some proportion of their railroads based not on what was best for the economy, but for troop transport to strategic area. So no, the railroads that the British built in India were valuable and are valuable. They benefit Indians to this very day, no matter how much you want to knee-jerk dismiss them.
Staying with India, between 15 and 29 million Indians died of starvation in British-induced famines.
Now, this is really easy to respond to. Just like all other European colonies, the population of India exploded under company rule and Raj rule. In fact, the inflection point of Indian population growth occurred around 1500, i.e. when the Portuguese started setting up coastal forts and trading stations. And from then onward, the population of India continued to grow at an unprecedented rate. In fact, the population grew so fast, even though the Indian economy was expanding at a faster rate than it had ever done in its history, the per capita wages generally fell. This is known as the Malthusian trap, where a population expands to match the growing economy, resulting in per-person living standards never improving, or in fact, perhaps even going down. And India was in this Malthusian trap, which it wouldn't break out of until the 1960s. So if the English were conducting a genocide, well, it was the most incompetent genocide in human history. Worst genocide ever. Lord Bartlesmith, how shall we commence genocide of the Indian continent? Well, Captain Dumblebottom, we shall increase the amount of land under cultivation. We shall increase the proportion of land irrigated. We shall introduce Western medicine as best we can, and we shall increase pig iron production 15 times, produce 1/3 as much steel as Japan, and we shall increase textile production tenfold from what it was in 1750. I mean, it's a joke, really. By the time of Indian independence, they had well over 400 million people. But the claims of genocide really boil down to specific events.
The most famous example, of course, was the Great Bengal Famine during the Second World War, when 4 million people died because Winston Churchill deliberately, as a matter of written minuted policy, proceeded to divert essential supplies from civilians in Bengal to sturdy Tommies and Europeans as reserve stockpiles. He said that the starvation of anyway underfed Bengalis mattered much less than that of sturdy Greeks. This is Churchill's actual quote. And when conscience-stricken British officials wrote to him, pointing out that people were dying because of this decision, he peevishly wrote in the margins of the file, "Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?"
Okay, Bengal famine. So a neat little story here by Tharoor. Now here's just an excerpt from how Wikipedia describes the causes of the Bengal famine. Quote, "Debate about the causes of the famine covers complex issues in an attempt to assign culpability, whether to natural forces, market failure or malfeasance of governmental institutions, war profiteering, or other unscrupulous acts by private businesses. The questionable accuracy of how much the available statistical data is a complicating factor, as is the fact that the debate and their conclusions are both political and politicized. The issue on the degree of the crop shortfall in late 1942 and its impact in 1943 has dominated the historiography of the famine. The issue reflects a larger debate between two perspectives. One emphasizes the importance of food availability decline, FAD, and another as a cause of the famine, and another focuses on the failure of exchange entitlements, FEE. The FAD explanation blames famine on crop failures brought on specifically by crises such as drought, flood, or man-made devastation from war. The FEE account argues that such external factors are in some cases important, but holds up that famine is primarily the interaction between pre-existing structural vulnerabilities such as poverty and a shock event such as war or political interference in markets that disrupts the economic market for food. When these interact, some groups within society can become unable to purchase or acquire food even though sufficient supplies are available. Both the FAD and FEE perspectives would agree that Bengal experienced at least some grain shortage in 1943 due to the loss of imports from Burma, because the Japanese had invaded Burma, damage from the cyclone, and brown spot infestation. However, FEE analysis do not consider the shortage the main factor, while FAD-oriented scholars such as Browick, 1986, hold that a sharp drop in food supply was the pivotal determining factor. Togger of 2003 and Padmanabhan, 1973, in particular, argue that the impact of brown spot disease was vastly underestimated, both during the famine and in later analyses. The signs of crop infestations by the fungus are subtle. Given the social and administrative conditions at the time, local officials would very likely have overlooked them. Academic consensus generally follows the FEE account as formulated by A. Sen. I don't know the full name of that man. And A. Sen, 1977-1981A, in describing the Bengal famine of 1943 as an entitlements famine. On this view, the prelude to the famine was generalized wartime inflation, and the problem was exacerbated by prioritized distribution and abortive attempts at price control, but the death blow was devastating leaps in the inflation rate due to heavy speculative buying. This in turn caused a fatal decline in the real wages of landless agricultural workers, transforming what should have been a local shortage into a horrific famine. And it just goes on and on and on like this, and this is probably 1/4 of the discussion section, just the discussion section, just sort of the 1/4 of 1/5 of the Wikipedia article on this topic. Right? The people who actually research the Bengal famine say it's really, really fucking complex. Or we can just go with Mr. Tharoor, the Indian politician, who says,
because Winston Churchill deliberately, as a matter of written minuted policy, proceeded to divert essential supplies from civilians in Bengal.
Yeah, Churchill bad. There you go. That's a much simpler explanation. Churchill bad, and Churchill did it. Forget all the detailed analyses by historians about this event. Tharoor figured out it's just, Orange Man bad. No, Churchill bad. And this gets to a more basic problem with the way people like Tharoor explain history and world affairs. That is, he operates in these little stories and anecdotes and pieces together a kind of gestalt about what happened from the bits and scraps that he reads, and instead of literally just looking up basic facts and figures. But also, to go through every little unquantifiable point that he makes, that would take hundreds of hours. So for you, being a real person trying to actually understand the world, you need statistics. Yes, people can lie with statistics, but it's a lot harder to do so, and it's almost never an outright lie, but a misleading perspective. For example, saying that India's share of the global textile industry went from 24% to 4%, or whatever the specific numbers is, that's not a lie. But it's misleading because it leads you to believe that the textile industry shrank when in actuality it grew at an unprecedented rate to become many times larger than it was previously. It just wasn't expanding as fast as it was in the European countries and Japan. But regarding the Bengal famine, just look at how complicated it is to tease out cause on that one issue. And everything Tharoor says is like this. So he makes a glib little statement, usually with some quote. Okay, some guy said something mean about Indians, and he makes this glib little statement about an enormous topic of research, and then he just leaves it in the dust and moves on to the next glib talking point. Right, Gish Gallop, if there ever was one. It should be called the Tharoor Gallop. And he doesn't deal in big aggregate data about the matter. When I present these large numbers on population, GDP, land under cultivation, industrial production, it's the big picture. This is, broadly speaking, what is going on. And any story about some specific event, such as the Bengal famine or something that was said to have been a massacre, that's like a little extra credit. That's just like a little garnish on top of the big picture of what was actually happening. Little specific events are, first off, profoundly unimportant once you know the basic structure of what happened, the basic population and economic facts and trajectories. And second off, the amount of work you have to do to verify all of these little claims about each and every one of these little events, such as the Bengal famine, such as some massacre that occurred at some time, or claimed to be massacre. The amount of research to go in and check and verify all these little events is astronomical. It is a profoundly inefficient way to learn about the world. Thoreau says he has any number of examples proving whatever he wants to believe, and I totally believe him. Thoreau, I believe you. I believe you have little anecdotes and conversation fillers to go on until the end of fucking time, which dummies will interpret you as having some deep and rich knowledge when really you don't know the basic facts about your country's own history. Right? You don't know that textile manufacturing went up under the Raj. And worse yet, you do, or you're just lying. I don't know which is worse. And so he gets on here and it's like, oh, he's talking about cricket and tea. Oh, he's so charming. And all the retards in the audience clap like seals as not a single chart or data table was presented that day. And just repeat platitudes because that's what the smart set believes now, that India was being genocided and all the bad things were done by Churchill. Another statement that the Impressionists will make is that the English didn't educate the Indian population much, and to the extent they did, well, I'll let Thoreau present the basic argument here.
You take language, for example. The British had no intention of imparting education to the masses of Indians and made it very clear they weren't going to spend the money doing that. And indeed, as late as 1930, the American historian Will Durant observed that the entire budget of the British for education in India, from the nursery level to the highest university levels, amounted to less than half the high school budget of the state of New York. And that was for the entire country of India with, at that point, 10 times as many people as the state of New York. The fact is that the British were not interested in investing in education, and even the English language was brought in just to educate a narrow class of sort of interpreters between the governors and the governed, people who would help the British by constituting a buffer between them and the dirty masses whom they ruled. I mean, that was very much the attitude. Macaulay actually said this in his notorious Minute on Education in India, where he said that we need to create a class of Indians, Indian in skin and color, but English in opinions and tastes and morals and in intellect. That was those were his exact words. And it was to serve their purposes.
Now, after the whopper on the textile industry, I decided to just look this up to see if this was actually true. And guess what, guys? This is literally not true. In terms of how education funds were spent in India, it was over 90% on primary schooling in all the years that it was measured, according to this paper here that I'll have linked in the description. The goal was to educate the masses, if we to our infer motive from what the money was actually being spent on. It was actually being spent on primary schooling, literally the exact opposite of what Thoreau here said. Now, in terms of total spending, it's important to see the actual data. Yes, India, a smaller proportion of government spending was spent on schools than was in the princely states which had more autonomy within the Raj. But the proportion of government spending spent on education wasn't much lower than Western European countries outside of the UK. And consider the results. Literacy in India went from around 3.25% in 1872 to around 17.88% in 1948. So a 5.5-fold increase. Admittedly in 76 years, but hey, what was the rate of increased literacy before British administration? It was none. It was flat. It was flat, probably somewhere around 3% going back to the BCs. And if one points out the higher education spending in the princely states, fair enough, but keep in mind that the princely states were still within the Raj. And the princely states weren't spending that much on education before the Raj, before the English took over. Now, we can always criticize and say maybe the English should have spent more on education, and I would agree. I think more money should have been spent on education than was. I think the amount was too low. But these breathless condemnations, or the claim that the British only funded higher level education because they wanted to create an administrative buffer out of the Indian elite educated in English ways, well, their actions don't point to this at all. Their actions point to an intent to engage in mass education and to improve literacy, and they actually had some significant results in that direction. The English presided over regular annual improvements in literacy year over year, and they managed this result despite the population increasing almost 63% from 1871 to 1948. And this little glib line about the high school budget in New York being greater than that of India, what is this supposed to mean? Is it the duty of the English to match that? To spend that much per person on a population that was anywhere from 240 to 390 million, depending on the year? Was it the duty of the English to bankrupt their entire economy in order to spend that much on every Indian child? And when Indians had more and more and more and more children, we had another 10 million children this year, pay up, English. Is that the requirement now? Also, the fact that labor costs were lower in India than in New York, it's just not an apples-to-apples comparison, even in terms of absolute monetary value, because the wage of a teacher in India is going to be lower than that of a teacher in New York because of the cost of living. But the whole basis of this is even ridiculous before you even get into the difference in cost of labor. But here's another thing to keep in mind, and this is something where Thoreau can call the English racist no matter what they do. Now, Thoreau attacks the English for spending most of the education budget on higher level education and not primary education. And we know this is false, but that's his argument. And I'm moving on to what is true or false and just looking at what his argument is. But what if Thoreau believed, as coincidentally happens to be the case, what if he believed that the English spent more on primary education than on higher level education? What would Thoreau's narrative be then? Well, if that were the case, I think Thoreau would argue that the English were only funding lower primary basic education because they didn't view the Indians as being capable of higher level reasoning, and thus not worth anything beyond a basic education, those racist Englishmen, and that it was more useful to have an Indian population that was basically literate and basically numerate, but they didn't want them to become too educated lest they get uppity or lest they start competing with the English economy itself. That would sort of be Thoreau's spin if Thoreau believed that the English were spending more on primary or basic education than on higher education. See, if the English focus the education funds on higher education, well, that means they're not interested in educating the masses in India, but are more interested in setting up a bureaucratic elite, right? Those racists, they don't care about the Indians. They're just using education of the elite Indians as a way to control the masses. But if they were to focus more on basic education than on higher education, well, then what they're doing is they're depriving Indians of more advanced education because the English are racists who don't think the Indians are either worthy of such education or don't want them to become too educated and too skillful lest they become economically competitive with industrial Britain. And that story is just as viable as Thoreau's story. In fact, Thoreau was able to find who knows how many little anecdotes and how many little quotes about the decline in Indian textile production, right? Even though that literally did not happen. Just because it didn't happen doesn't mean Thoreau can't find all sorts of anecdotes saying it happened. And the fact that the Raj spent more on higher than lower education, right, which we know is false, but Thoreau was able to find plenty of anecdotes and plenty of little quotes pointing to this false notion that the Raj spent more on higher than primary education. Right, so this is also sort of an object lesson in how worthless these little trinket anecdotes and these little quotes, right, this bullshit history are at actually getting at the truth. Okay, there's a wonderful little line that's floating around that the British extracted $45 trillion worth of resources from India in 1990 dollars. And this was said to have occurred from 1765 to 1938 in a paper published in a Columbia journal. And this is wonderful. I'm so glad the Impressionists picked this comically impossible figure. If they picked a lower number, then it would be harder to argue against, because let's say they said that the British stole $500 billion worth of stuff. As we'll later see, that might be physically possible. Now, not practically possible because they would starve so many of the Indian population. There'd be no way for the population to grow if they took $500 billion over that period. But it would at least be like it would be within the realm of physical reality. Because we have to ask, how much stuff was in the Indian economy from 1765 to 1938? Well, the population in 1750 was around 183 million. The population in 1800 was around 190 million. So to estimate the population in 1765, you have to multiply the two, but you have to just do a linear regression, but then time. You know what? Fuck it. The population of India in 1941, 3 years after the end date of Utsa Patnaik's so-called analysis here, was 389 million. So you know what? Let's just say India had 389 million people for all 173 years of Patnaik's analysis. Let's say they had 389 million people in 1765 all the way up to 1938. The per capita GDP, of course, was anywhere from $682 to $526 per person, and so we have to do it every single year, and we have to weight by population every single. You know what? Fuck it. Let's give them $700 per person, right? Let's just, that's higher than any number, any value on this table, but let's just $700 per person, 389 million people a year. And let's say that the British were in charge of the whole continent in all of those years, that there was no transition period, that on the year 1765, they were in charge of the whole thing, from Burma to the borders of Afghanistan. These are wildly high numbers, but even using these ridiculous numbers, you get India having an economy of 272.3 billion each year. Multiply this by 173, and the economic production of India using these ridiculous overestimates of their economy would have been 47.11 trillion. So, the British took 45 trillion, or 95.7% of the Indian economy, leaving the Indians to manage with the remaining 4.3% of what they produced. This is a joke. And if we were to use more realistic numbers, realistic assumptions about the population and about the size of the Indian economy over these years, it becomes apparent that India did not have $45 trillion worth of stuff to loot. It was probably something more like 30 trillion, but I'm not even going to bother to do the work because because even using ridiculous numbers, this is impossible. But then I get a problem when I do this, because you have people who will imagine that, okay, maybe it wasn't 45 trillion, maybe it was just 1 trillion that was looted, or maybe it was only 500 billion that was looted. And so this is the ratchet effect, right? They throw out a ridiculous number, 45 trillion, and then when that's pointed out to be literally physically impossible, they then go, oh, well, then they sort of bargain down to a lower number that now suddenly seems more reasonable when it's contrasted with 45 trillion. 1 trillion looted from India, okay, that sounds reasonable now that you just said 45 trillion. But the reality is there's no more basis for that 1 trillion number than there was for the 45 trillion number. It just seems reasonable by comparison. It's a psychological trick. But the reality is that the British Empire as a whole didn't appear to confer any, at least noticeable, economic benefit to Britain. And something I did some time ago was what I called the colonization index, showing how many colonial subjects a European empire had relative to its home population, and then comparing that to its later economic success in 1970 and in 2013. And since I was dealing with colonialism as a whole, this has later years because I'm talking a lot about Africa and the decolonization of Indonesia, and so I needed to use a later year when it was sort of all wrapped up. India went sort of early in 1948. And what this shows is that countries with big empires in 1940 were no better off than European countries without empires by 1970. In fact, they're a little bit worse off. They're a little bit low in the stack here. And if we compare the United Kingdom to its neighbors in Europe, we see that from 1820 to 1913, the height of the British Empire, was also precisely the time frame in which Britain began falling back into the rest of the pack of Western Europe. Not behind Western Europe, but sort of falling back into the ranks of Western Europe. It was no longer exceptional. So if Britain is getting trillions and trillions of loot from India, well, it doesn't appear to be doing them a whole lot of good. In fact, after 1948, when India was released, the growth of the British economy accelerated. And that should give you pause, because wait a minute, if the British economy was built on the back of India and all the loot they were getting from India, shouldn't the British economy have faced a severe downturn following India's independence? And yet, just the opposite. It's as if a ball and chain had been released from Britain. Ooh, ain't that a deep cut? In fact, I could use this data to say something that many people throughout history have said. Empire is folly, and that the British Empire was far from being some great benefit to Britain, but was in fact a financial drain. I mean, you certainly don't look at this little graph here and go, oh, Britain really benefited from controlling India. That's not the narrative that pops out at you. As Britain is securing control over India, they're starting to economically fall back into the pack of Western Europe. Now, on balance of trade, Thoreau says some stuff that is incredibly misleading, but also technically false. Using UN trade statistics, we can look at the United Kingdom and the Raj's balance of trade in 1900. In 1900, under the Raj, which is modern-day India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Burma, and Sri Lanka, exported 374 million and imported 260 million, giving them a balance of trade of plus 114 million in 1960 dollars. The United Kingdom in 1900 exported 1,417 million and imported 2,290 million in 1960 dollars, giving them a balance of trade of negative 873 million. So that is the context in which to look at what Thoreau has a bug up his butt about, which is this. The trade specifically between the Raj and the UK was 155 million in exports from the UK to the Raj and 118 million in exports from the Raj to the UK, resulting in a trade balance of plus 37 million for the UK and minus 37 million for the Raj. And this is supposed to be an impoverishing trade deficit for India. What's actually happening is that Thoreau and people like Thoreau don't really know what a trade deficit is and don't hardly know anything about global trade in the 1800s and are just looking for some way to make the British into a scapegoat. On top of this, the line that India was the UK's largest export market in 1900 is probably false. It was probably Germany. First off, the Raj bought 10.9.4% of the UK's export. Western Europe bought 35.36%. I did some math using Madison's GDP estimates, and based on a simple linear regression, Germany was 33.85% of continental Western Europe's GDP. And assuming Germany's share of UK goods they bought was the same as their proportion of the Western European economy, they would have bought 11.97% of the United Kingdom's exports in 1900, making Germany, not India, the UK's largest export market in 1900. Of course, we're assuming that Germany is buying British goods in proportion to the size of their economy, and if that assumption is wrong, Germany's proportion could actually be larger than this or smaller than this if they're buying more or less than the relative size of their economy. But whether it was actually Germany or India that was the UK's largest export market misses the point. The Raj was not being impoverished by a negative balance of trade. And if anyone was anyone's cash cow, the UK was the world's cash cow. Of course, as we've seen previously, the Raj was not impoverished by Britain at all, so this trade imbalance idea is an explanation for something that didn't even happen. As a percentage of GDP, British exports to India constituted a whopping 0.37% of the British economy. And as a grand finale, all of this assumes trade imbalances even matter. Look, in 1900, the UK was running a trade deficit of 2.06% of their GDP, and India was running a 0.27% trade surplus. Yet from 1900 to 1913, the UK went from being 102% the size of India's economy to being 110% the size of India's economy, despite running massive trade deficits. So the very premise of Thoreau's whole argument here is dubious. Just as an aside, one of the claims that some great wealth was looted from India is based on a belief that India was as wealthy as England on a per capita basis before, Europeans ravaged the continent. Now, the main problem with this idea is that in the 1500s, Portugal, forget Britain, Portugal, like this little country, was able to not conquer India fair enough, but they were able to win a few military victories and establish coastal strongholds. And this was in the 1500s, long before the Industrial Revolution and the Great Divergence, where Europe really shot past the rest of the world economically. Now, I know money and wealth doesn't 100% translate into military proficiency, but the fact that Portugal, while having to sail halfway around the world, could kind of bust up and push around a country with probably something around 20 times the population, despite the logistical disadvantages that Portugal had in sailing halfway around the world to do this, and to do so for hundreds of years, makes the idea that the Mughals, just weren't interested in military proficiency seem like a retarded explanation for that. Oh, the Mughals allowed the Portuguese to have these coastal forts and strongholds because the Mughals just didn't care about it, or they didn't care about losing battles to the Portuguese. Come on. Now, for Thoreau, this isn't some neutral academic exercise. His career is centered around playing to the Indian oppression narrative. If he were to recognize that his basic narrative was false, that would be to admit his life's work was based on a lie. So under no circumstances can he ever admit this or ever concede his core narrative on this. And this isn't some banal falsehood. This is the bread and butter of ultranationalist narratives that lead to future atrocities. It is hate speech in the truest sense, and it is the first step on a road to something very bad. Classic example of this, of course, is Hitler claiming falsely that Germany was put upon by the Versailles Treaty, or the Japanese claiming falsely that the Western powers were colluding to prevent them from having an empire like Britain did. Of course, the Japanese weren't aware of the fact that these empires didn't actually make Britain or France wealthy, but they considered it oppression that they, as Japan, was denied having an empire of a similar scale of Britain. Or in South Africa, how the Zulus twisted the desire of the whites wanting to live in their own white-only spaces, just like every ethnic group wants to have, and whites wanting to live this way in land in which whites occupied before the Zulus actually migrated from the north. They twisted this into some mythology that they, the Zulus, were actually being oppressed by the whites, which they then use to this day to justify laws prohibiting whites from owning businesses or simply stealing farms from white families, and these land reform policies which have destroyed other countries such as Zimbabwe. All of this is justified with the myth of oppression, and it really couldn't be otherwise. In order to carry out a horrible act against another group of people, you must internalize that they did something horrible to you. That's the only way that most people, or at least the great mass of people, can actually justify it to themselves. Sir, some sociopaths and psychopaths and criminals can engage in heinous acts just because, but for most people they need a cause. They need a myth of rape to justify the revenge. Rape and revenge. These oppression narratives, they're not liberal, they're not enlightened, and they're at least as old as the Old Testament, when the Hebrews falsely portrayed themselves as being oppressed by the pharaohs, which was then used to justify sacking towns in northern Egypt on their way to the Levant. And of course the Pharaoh then sent an army to pursue the Hebrews after getting word that the Hebrews were sacking towns in northern Egypt for supplies. In turnabout, the Palestinians today use a bogus narrative to justify their attacks on the Israelis. The myth that their land was stolen by the Israelis, when I don't want to go into that here, but it really wasn't. And of course, throughout Europe, there are numerous examples of this. The Poles, for example, seizing land from Germany and from Germans and Russian minorities, as the Germans and Russians had supposedly prior been oppressing Poland, even though Poland owed its very existence to Germany as a result of Germany creating the Kingdom of Poland during World War I. And of course, the Balkans are full a whole bunch of small rape and revenge narratives too numerous to count. So when so-called liberals and so-called leftists feed into these lies about European colonial oppression, what you're doing is you're providing cover and legitimacy for ultranationalist movements, not the kind of healthy group identification sort of thing, but a real sort of rape and revenge, we deserve reparations. That's what reparations is. It's the rape and revenge narrative. It's nationalism, and it's an aggressive form of ultranationalism that is only ever powered by a myth of rape. Now, I'm doing the opposite. I'm trying to diffuse these conflicts. And in order to diffuse these conflicts, I'm trying to say, no, you weren't raped. That's what you have to do. In order to diffuse the cause of ultranationalist atrocious wars, you have to debunk the myth of rape. But when I do this, we're then left with a very uncomfortable question for the Indians in this instance, which is they ask, well, if you didn't rape me, why am I poor? And that is the psychological bind. Well, you're poor because of choices made by you. And the effects of the European empires were anything from neutral to slightly positive. And that's a very hard pill to swallow. So they'll cling to these anecdotes. They'll cling to some simplistic interpretation of the Bengal famine. They'll blow into puritanical proportion this or that massacre of a rebellion. It's a very hard pill to swallow to tell the Indians that they are and always were the ones most responsible for their own situation, that they are the chief culprit. It is much easier psychologically to find a scapegoat, and who other than the British themselves to serve the role as this scapegoat. They're certainly a very salient entity in Indian history. They're somewhat foreign. They are perfect. They're perfectly positioned to serve the role as the scapegoat. And when you step back for a second, what other than this could Tharoor possibly be doing? We know that rape and revenge narratives and scapegoats are ubiquitous throughout history. We know that Tharoor gets basic facts about industrial and education policy wrong in his little smear screeds. He's an Indian nationalist, and the British are his scapegoat in the Indian rape and revenge narrative. They serve the exact same function as Jews did in European history. Blame all of your problems on Jews in rape and revenge narratives because they were market-dominant minorities that made you pay your rent. You weren't oppressed. You tried to conquer as much as you could whenever you could. Everyone on the planet did. The Europeans were just better at it. And in an unprecedented decision, these Europeans voluntarily gave up their empires. You never defeated the British militarily. Unlike the United States, you didn't have to fight a war to achieve your independence. They gave it to you almost for free, and in turn, you cursed them. How petulant. European rule led to a period of unprecedented economic and population growth and a rise in literacy to what it had never seen before. But you were mad because India wasn't doing as well as England itself, as though England owed you, what, parity with itself? And so you cooked up these myths that England oppressed you, and now there's this dangerous far-right, ultra-nationalist rape and revenge narrative that people like Tharoor are pushing, and it remains to be seen how it will play out. But let's be clear. However glib and charming people like Tharoor are, what he says is far-right hate speech, and it is not only factually wrong, but morally wrong. And it is a result of envy, wrath, and racism. Now, you can't respond to every dumb thing Tharoor says because for him, it's like 5 minutes to think up the dumb idea and find some stupid little quote or anecdote, and then it's like 2 hours of work for me figuring out first how to verify what's being said, because sometimes it's not obvious how to even check if a quote or anecdote really tells you what's going on, then to go in and find some relevant source and then try to figure out if this is true or false. And because Tharoor just makes it up so quickly, it's almost always false. And at some point, you have to just say enough is enough. On every claim that Tharoor made that I could find some quantitative way to verify, he's been wrong. And so he's like, what, 0 for 5 now? But who's counting? But there are two other little arguments that Tharoor made in one of these little presentations that Tharoor likes to poo-poo. He poo-poos the idea that British brought political unity and democracy to India.
Democracy, and you mentioned political unity. Well, political unity is the one that the British point to with pride, that they came into a bunch of warring principalities and they made a country out of it. Not so. For 2,000 years before the British ever set foot on India, there had been a very clear sense of a common civilizational unity and an aspiration on the part of monarchs to consolidate that territorially. Now, obviously, they couldn't. I mean, we had two people who came very close. There was the Mauryan Empire, Ashoka and Chandragupta, who controlled about 90% of the subcontinent, including Afghanistan. And then the Mughals, particularly between Akbar and Aurangzeb, they controlled about 95% of the subcontinent. And that was the extent. But the fact that everyone tried to do it, aspired to do it, and failed in trying shows that if the British hadn't succeeded, somebody else around the same time with the advantages of modern communications and so on would have. So political unity was not a British gift. Democracy had to be prized from the reluctant grasp of the British. In fact, the history of the advent of democracy in India, as I demonstrate in the book, is actually littered with the broken promises of English rulers who keep promising responsible self-government and then sort of yanking it away just when the time came for them to redeem their pledge. And the example after example of this, until finally, sort of more or less democratic system. I say more or less because the franchise was still limited by literacy and population, so it was not a majority of the people. But still, a franchise, a vote was offered to Indians properly for the first time in 1937. Before that, there'd been elections, but, for example, in the 1920s, only 1 out of every 250 Indians had the vote. So hardly a training ground for democracy. And even then, they did not allow people to vote for a national government. The national government was still the British, headed by the Viceroy. It was only provincial governments that Indians were allowed to form up to the Second World War. So given all of that, it's very difficult to point. And as I say, the British did a great deal to undermine Indian unity. When the Indian National Congress was established in 1885 by a well-meaning Scotsman with various Indian supporters, it was truly a body the British could have easily co-opted. It was a bunch of largely Anglophile lawyers who wrote decorous petitions and held very civilized meetings in which they asked the English to give them the rights of Englishmen. But the British saw even this as a threat. So far from welcoming it as a first step towards responsible self-government for Indians, what the British did instead was try and undermine the Congress to the extent of helping encourage the setting up of a rival body 20 years later, the Muslim League, which was set up explicitly on sectarian lines, with the British prodding them to say, look, these people will only represent the interests of the Hindu majority. Now, you look at their first 20 presidents, and they're Christians, Muslims, Parsis, as well as Hindus. And there's even an Irish woman, an Irish Catholic, Annie Besant, of the Theosophist movement. So it was a very open, very inclusive body, but the British had no intention of cooperating with it, had no intention of taking it serious. And these are not retrospective judgments. I've quoted, for example, a Sunday Times journalist from London who traveled in India in 1907, 1908, Henry Nevinson, who attended meetings of the Congress, met British officialdom, and recorded his horror at the way in which the British were denying fair due process and fair rights to Indians.
Now, just for the record, I don't believe in either political unity or democracy as some general good. Thoreau says Britain didn't give India democracy because the British suppressed democratic movements while they were in India. Okay, what was the state of Indian democracy before the British arrived? It was non-existent. This is stupid. Democracy exists because of the West, and first and foremost because of the influence of the United Kingdom in the world. Japan became somewhat democratic due to their contact and mimicry of the United States and the United Kingdom. Before that, there was nothing democratic in Japan. Same with India. There were no native democratic movements in India before contact with the Europeans, particularly Britain. All democracy in India is mimicry of the West. I'm sure they try to gussy it up or make it appear authentically Indian by making maybe some strained analogy to some Vedic council 1,000 years ago or something, but everyone knows they're aping the West. And the timeline of when India adopted democratic institutions, that's the smoking gun, that they're doing it because of mass contact with the West, particularly Britain. The fact that the British suppressed democratic movements in India to maintain their rule, that's irrelevant to the fact that it was Western, particularly British influence on India in the first place that created those democratic movements. That said, who knows if that's really even an accurate tale, that the British suppressed democratic movements within India. I mean, maybe that's just another one of these stories that people believe. Right along there with the British destroyed the Indian textile industry. Again, I don't even think democracy is a good thing, but to say India would have become democratic anyway, when it hadn't in its past 2,000-year history, and only became democratic after extended contact with the UK, it's like putting your hand on a hot stove and then your hand gets hot and then say, oh, well, my hand would have gotten hot anyway. Now, as for political unity, well, this is really easy. While the British were talking about releasing India, there were discussions about what India really meant, kind of like arguments about what the Ukraine really meant following the breakup of the Soviet Union. And long before 1948, Muslims were agitating for their own state. They didn't want to be ruled by Hindus. The people of Burma also didn't want to be part of India either. And so India broke apart immediately following their independence. Now, if you want to claim that India and Pakistan, which fought several small wars, by the way, post-independence, if you want to say they would have been harmonious partners had they been part of the same country in an India that inherited the entirety of the territory of the Raj, well, I don't have much else to say, then you're just kind of a dum-dum. The fact that the British were the only thing holding the second most populous empire in the world together was a reality that just played out in real time during the negotiations for independence. The truth of the British as being the sole source of unity for this gargantuan empire was manifest in what actually happened. Like, here we have India under Britain, and then Britain leaves and it immediately breaks apart like this. And then someone says, oh, the British weren't keeping it together. It would have gotten together like that anyway. Like, what? Like, when Alexander the Great's empire fell apart after his death, imagine the people at the time going, Alexander didn't create this unity. The world was heading in that direction anyway. And then he dies, and then his empire breaks apart. What are you talking about? No, Alexander was what was keeping that unified. The British were what was keeping that unified. Now, even this tale that India was heading towards unification anyway, was it? Looking at this year-by-year territorial changes, arguably the Mughals got close-ish, but they never got anywhere near as far as Britain did. And then they were beaten back by the Maratha Confederacy. And there were some periods where an empire within India got pretty big, but then they would get beaten back, and none of them were ever as big as even the truncated modern post-1948 state of India. Again, look, the British unified the continent. This isn't a debate point. This is something that is true, and it's being pointed out, and bigoted Indian nationalists don't like it because it's giving the British credit for something. That's what this comes down to. When the British left, it fell apart, and no previous empire ever came close to the amount of unified territory under the British. Again, I'm indifferent to the value of unity, and I don't think unifying lots of people under the same government is necessarily a good thing. It's probably a bad thing, in my opinion. I'm just pointing out that this is yet another thing that the Ruhr is so obviously balls in your face wrong about. Now, what I've done here is explain why India's problems can't be blamed on the British. But then what's the explanation? Well, I have an operational explanation that's based not on some deep research of India in particular, but on what I've read about traditional economies, often referred to as feudal economies, basically economies dominated by landlords and guilds. Even during the Raj, there were tariffs within India and heavy regulations on who was allowed to work in what trade and how you were allowed to produce everything. Europe was like this too a long time ago, so was China, so was Japan. And it was when Europe, then Japan, then China broke out of this that they finally began to have any significant economic growth. This is something important to consider, is that basically all improvements in per capita living standards occurred in the world starting in like the 1700s, 1800s. Before that, the world was stagnant at anywhere between $400 and $700 per capita in $1990. So the economy as we know it comes from the Industrial Revolution. And that's something that a lot of people don't know. Basically, all economic growth in the world occurred as a result of breaking out of this traditional economy, creating a common market where you can buy and sell just about anything within a country and have the free movement of labor and the ability to buy and sell land and buildings to whoever you want, and sometimes even the freedom to do this between countries. For people today, this is just second nature. This is obviously how things are and how things should be to people in the world today. But it's not a given. These things, the ability to work in whatever trade you want, to buy and sell to whoever you want, and have the ability to set your own prices. Now, whether you'll be able to sell those prices is a different question, but the ability to set your own prices and to do this anywhere within your country or often even between countries, this is not the natural default state of man. This is capitalism, and it was constructed by the state. The idea of a market common to the whole of England, where you're not limited in buying and selling, within your county or within your district or whatever, and where you would only have access to exotic foreign goods at the occasional fairs, like the exotic foreign goods, like something made in Spain, ooh la la, and you can get those once a year at the local fair or whatever. Today we think of a market as an abstract thing, but back then a market was a physical location where you were legally allowed to buy and sell certain goods, and only licensed shoemakers could sell shoes. Only licensed coopers could make barrels. Only licensed Wagners could make wagon wheels, etc., etc. And the prices they could sell at were very much restricted. And if you think this sounds stupid, well, what would happen if you asked a 12-year-old how to make a town? Like, say, a 12-year-old's king of the town, how does he make a town? Well, the 12-year-old would say something like, well, we need to have a guy who bakes bread. Jimmy's good at baking bread. Okay, Jimmy's the bread maker. And Tom's good at making shoes. Tom will make the shoes. And Sarah's good at sewing, so she'll make clothes, or she'll be one of the people that makes clothes. Clothes is a bit more involved, so we'll have a few people make clothes. And they'll be the clothes maker. So we got the bread maker, the shoe maker, the clothes maker. Oh, it's all set up. Oh, and why don't we have some rules about how Tom makes the shoes? Because we want nice shoes, right? We want to have them made in a certain way that are nice. So let's make rules saying that you have to make shoes in a certain way. Also, no price gouging. We need to limit the prices at which Tom can sell shoes at. Oh, and nobody can come in and just start making shoes and undercut Tom, right? Because Tom needs his job, he needs stability, and we want to create work stability. We don't want people randomly, changing professions and becoming poor or whatever. So if you want to make shoes, you need to talk to the town or talk to the 12-year-old and then decide. And so what you find is that this traditional economy, every element, when we talk about it sort of at first glance, it seems kind of stupid, but when you actually break it down and you think about it in terms of the way humans socially interacting with each other, it's actually very intuitive, and it seems almost inevitable that this is how humans are going to organize. They're going to have certain specific people with certain specific jobs, and those are the jobs that they do, and it's going to be guaranteed. And they're going to be protected from competition, but also everyone else is going to be protected from price gouging. But the end result of this, though, is that there's not a whole lot of freedom, right? So you can see how it's very intuitive, but by golly, can you also not see how it can be rather limiting and result in technological and economic stagnation, like perhaps thousands of years of technological and economic stagnation. The idea of a common market came when some people in England and the Netherlands thought to create law regarding the buying and selling of goods for the whole of the country and the free movement of professions, breaking down this intuitive traditional economy. Laws and protections had to be constructed to create what we know as a free market economy. It's not emergent. It is constructed. Capitalism was constructed by the state. It's not natural. It is not the default state of man, and it was something that had to be forced upon India piece by piece. India was still in this mode of the traditional economy, sometimes simplistically called feudalism to some degree, even in the 1940s, and the British gave the Indians more autonomy than they did their other colonial possessions. And what this did is it allowed for these backward practices to persist in India that were being phased out in other parts of the empire. I know Thoreau loves to shit on Churchill, but another reason for the Bengal famine being as bad as it was is that some provinces of India had export limits on how much grain they could sell to other provinces, and an export duty on grain being sold to other provinces within the Raj itself. If you wanted to sell grain to Bengal, you had to pay an export duty. India at this time did not have a fully fledged common market, or what we would call a market economy. They had bits and pieces, and it's complicated to define where and when parts of the Raj adopted more of what I guess you would call capitalist institution. And it was when Europe and Japan broke free of their traditional landlord and guild and controlled market system that they became what they are. And when you think about why and when Europe had its massive economic development, then it becomes stupidly obvious why and when India would start to have the massive economic development it has had recently. It doesn't have anything to do with trade deficits or how much English cloth you're importing. It has to do with basic institutions. And once India made the same basic institutional changes that Western Europe and Japan did, they started to have that hockey stick level of economic growth that Western Europe and Japan did when they made those changes. Now, obviously, that level of growth is not going to go on forever. It's going to plateau at some point, just like it did in Europe and in Japan. But India is in that process of capitalistizing. Keep in mind that Black Africa, which was under more absolutist British control, was wealthier per person than India was in 1948, which is to say a region of the world that in 1500 was poorer per person than India ended up being wealthier by the end while having more direct European rule than was practiced in India through the Raj. And in fact, even within Africa itself, the parts of Africa that were more colonized by any European power in terms of time under control or percentage of population that was white, the black people in the more colonized parts of Africa ended up better off than the black people in the less colonized parts of Africa. Some of the wealthiest people, I think maybe there's like Mauritius or something where the blacks are actually wealthier, but in terms of the real countries of Africa, blacks in South Africa are the wealthiest people in the continent of all the black people in Africa. As for the British rule in India, they did yeoman's work, and they created some of the benefits of industrialization while, in my opinion, foolishly respecting India's traditional economy. I think they respected it too much. And so India was kind of a strange anachronism at the time. They had some of these modern factories and textile mills and some of these steel mills and railroads, but at the same time, they still had the equivalent of guilds, and they were limited in what professions and how you could buy and sell certain goods, and they still had that traditional economy while also having the fruits of capitalism sort of crammed in there. And so it's a very strange situation, almost kind of unique in world history. But no, the British didn't rape you, and I think that's the line to end on. Wow, that was a long one, and after an over 2-month hiatus. So, am I back? Well, I'll tell you I'm back, but that's what I said last time, so time will tell. Video ideas coming up are a thorough going over of the glorified Just So story known as Guns, Germs, and Steel, biological Leninism, and a response to Taleb, and also, to my surprise, to JFJRP on the validity of IQ. Now, I don't take donations. However, I recommend donating to a guy, Cool Tapes, who runs a Patreon where he posts really cool pictures that are posted at roughly the same frequency as I post videos. And you can also donate to him via PayPal, which I don't use. Those links are in the description. There is also a Discord server being run. Link in the description. It will be useful for collecting studies and working on a race and IQ project. Remember, Discord servers are basically forums. They are public spaces. Everything you say is viewable by everyone, even your DMs. Do not use Discord to do private stuff. Don't fall for the illusion of privacy. You don't have any of it. But beyond that, this is the end of the video.